Hi, so welcome to the next panel for YA ThrillerCon, and I'm really delighted to be joined by three amazing authors, and we're going to be talking all about boarding schools as a setting for our books. So this is a live broadcast, so if you're watching live and you have a question for any one of our panelists, you can actually send your questions in and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the panel. So there are three different ways that you can send your questions in, and it depends on which platform you're watching this broadcast on. So if you're watching on YouTube, there's the live chat facility and you can just enter your comment in there and we will get it. If you're watching on Facebook, put your question in a comment and it will still come through to me and I'll be able to feed it through to the panelists to answer. And if you're watching on Twitter, please just reply to the video where it's posted on our Twitter account at YA ThrillerCon, and I will be checking that account at the end of this broadcast as well. So then we will gather together all the questions from our lovely viewers. So we are talking about boarding schools, and the reason for this is because we've all written a book or are writing a book that has a boarding school as a setting. So my latest release is The Rhythm of My Soul, and I wrote this one as Dyer, which is one of my pen names, and it's dark academia, but set in the prestigious ballet world, with professional ballet dancers doing everything that they can to secure places in companies. And it also means that they're plotting against each other because they're in direct comparison and competition with all their classmates. So that's a bit about my book. So Caroline, would you like to introduce yourself and your book?
Yeah, I'm Caroline England and I'm the author of psychological thrillers. And my fifth one, as you can see behind me, The Sinner, has just come out. But that isn't the boarding school one. The boarding school one is Betray Her. And the title of the book might give you a clue as to the sort of story it is. Should I describe the book now, or are we going back into that?
No, right, you can go ahead now.
Yeah, it's about two friends, Joe and Kate, who meet at boarding school aged 8. And the story is, you see their story when they're 8, you see their story when they're 18, and then you have the present day narrative. And they have this tight, close bond since childhood. But as in all my books, all is not what it seems. And in the present time, that their adult world, they're just approaching 40, secrets and, a dark secret at the heart of their friendship starts to unravel. So that's pretty much it.
Amazing. And that is definitely on my to-be read list. So, Abdi, would you like to go next, introducing yourself and your book?
Sure. Hi, I'm Abdi Nazemian. I am an author and also a screenwriter and film producer. I'm here in Los Angeles, very far from the rest of the authors, but I actually come to London quite a bit to write. It's my most inspiring place, so I'm very excited to be on this panel. And my boarding school novel, which is my latest novel, is called The Chandler Legacies. And it is inspired by my own time at boarding school here in the United States. And it's about a group of writing students who, through the writing workshop that they take with an English teacher there, uncover the culture of abuse and hazing at the school and try to do something to change it.
Wow. Sounds great.
It is such a wonderful book as well, because as soon as I read it and I was like thinking about putting together this panel, I was like, I need to invite Abdi to this panel. So
all of your books sound incredible, and they do. I want to read all of them, so I will be doing that when this panel is over.
Immediately after.
Yes. Immediately. So Marisa, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. I am a YA author. I write within horror, dystopian, fantasy, but I always include mental health in my books. My latest one is The Unraveling of Luna Forrester, which is a dark fantasy and a very loose Red Riding Hood retelling. Now, this isn't my boarding school book. I have 2 boarding school books, but I haven't published them yet. And the one that I'm working on at the moment is actually a young adult Dracula retelling. And that does take place primarily at a boarding school and at like an old estate manor. It goes back and forth between the two. I also had been at a boarding school. I was at a really posh boarding school here in the UK for sixth form, as was my brother. So I use a lot of my own experiences about how that is set up to portray that kind of life that exists in the boarding school hierarchy, should I say. Yeah.
That is so interesting. And I know later on I'm going to be asking you specifically about research that you do and like whether it's based on personal experience or whether your actual boarding schools in your books are based on real boarding schools. But for now, I would like to sort of like look generally at what it is about the boarding school as a setting that appeals to you as writers. So Abdi, would you like to go first on this one?
Sure. Well, look, for me, I've always been fascinated by boarding school stories because I went to boarding school, and because I went all 4 years, and they were probably 4 of the most impactful years of my life because, well, for one thing, I moved around a lot as a kid. I'm from Iran. There was a revolution. We went to France and then to Canada and then to the United States. So outside of my cousins, I didn't really have any friends. So boarding school is really where I met the first people who became my lifelong friends, the people who made me feel seen, which is a lot of what the book is about. But it's also a place that really broke me down. Like I said, there was this, culture of hazing, abuse. There were, the institution was very powerful. There was this sense of like the people in the institution really being dwarfed by it, which I think is a very evocative thing to write about, like a place that has so much history that you feel like, how could I make, matter in a place like this? And posh, like Marisa said, a great word. It's so posh. You go to school with people who are the kids of world leaders and movie stars. You're like, well, who am I? So there's a sense of both powerlessness, but then also a sense of like, this is the place where I stepped into my power for the first time. And I think that's such an interesting thing to write about. And, for me, it was scary writing this book because this book's very personal. It's very vulnerable. That always scares me, but I always tend to want to write the things that scare me most and, go as deep into my own psyche as I can. And, I've always loved boarding school stories. I've seen Dead Poet Society like dozens of times, and truthfully, there's very few of them. I think, given how many boarding schools they are, there's not that many stories that really capture it. So I was excited to add one, to the pile.
Can I just ask you on that? You said you like to write about your fears. Does that scare you, confronting that? Or do you, how do you deal with things that make you feel vulnerable, when you go through that process?
I don't, well, I mean, I'm curious I want to ask you all the questions because I think all of us as writers have to ask ourselves this. But I mean, I have a very, I don't know if any of you guys know the book, The Artist's Way, which is a book about writing by a woman named Julia Cameron. It's like, I highly recommend it. Anyone listening who's a creative person of any kind should read it. But a lot of it is about, writing. It's a more spiritual form of writing. I don't plot my books. I tend to write in a very organic way. I tend to write very quickly. I do a lot of preparation, but I tend to try and let things flow through me. So it makes the process, I think I'm not controlling the process, but then the sharing of the work is very scary. I mean, with this one, I was very scared of people I went to school with reading it and what will they think, and former faculty member, like, will people think I sold out the secrets of the school? Or, I had a call from a friend who's now a teacher there who was curious about whether we should be opening a case against, the people who perpetrated things 30 years ago. And I'm like, no, that's not what the book is about. It's not a book about retribution or revenge. It's about the importance of telling our stories to get through it, and to empower ourselves. So that does scare me. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, really interesting. Thank you.
What about you? I'm done.
I've forgotten what the original question was now.
So I was just asking, what is it that sort of draws you to boarding schools?
Lower boarding school. Do you know, I think I have found, I ingested The West Witch when I was young, and I just adored The West Witch. And I think I loved the concept of it then, and that she was just always getting into trouble, but she was so lovely. And when I went to boarding school, one of the things that really amazed me was that there are no parents, and the hierarchy that exists within those gates you know, your whole world, it's like being in a fantasy kingdom. Your whole world is in this school for an entire semester or term until you walk out for your vacation or your Christmas holidays and see your parents again. Or, I mean, in my case, I got to go home every Sunday, but obviously a lot of people don't. And it was really interesting how the kids ruled the school, and the cool kids and the, you know, those people really had control. And the people that weren't cool or struggled, the mental health issues and the things that they were forced to do, some of the behavior that happened, not so much now, but back in my day, was just so atrocious that the mindset fascinates me. When you, it's kind of like a Lord of the Flies, maybe not that extreme, but when you get that many kids in an environment together, you know, flying under the radar of the teacher's, you know, eye, what actually can go on. And so living this experience, I was just like, I cannot believe the amount of stuff that is allowed to happen, that people get away with. And I just found it such an interesting experience. And obviously I went through my own stuff and had my own issues with people, but when I look back on it, I just think, and you're going through those transformative years, as you said, Abdi, you know, it's an emotional time, and you make such good friends because you don't have parents to rely on, you don't necessarily have an older or younger sibling to rely on while you're there. You've got each other, and that's it. So those friendships that you make are so important because you're navigating that world together and only together. So I like to try and explore how that works. And in this retelling that I'm doing, I've got my Dracula character and his best friend Van Helsing, who are almost having a bromance. They are so close. They've been at boarding school since they were 7, and it gets to a point where they disagree, and it's a life and death situation. But all throughout the book, it's how close they are and how similar they are, but this splits them. So I'm really looking forward to having that moment with them because they've been so tight. So that's my rambling answer to your question.
That sounds wonderful. So yeah, Caroline, what about you? What is it that draws you?
Well, I had to write at least one book about boarding school because it's ingrained on my psyche. I was there from the age of 8 to 18. Wow. And back in the day when I was at boarding school, it was a pretty horrible place. And I'm like Abdi, the abuse, and I'm touching on that in my story. The grooming. My 2 characters are Joe and Kate, and I'm a blend of those two because I was the Yorkshire girl coming into a posh environment. So I was a bit, you know, they're mocked by my Yorkshire accent and so you have to conform. And sort of my best friend was a posh girl. And again, we've got Joe and Kate, who are the posh girl and the sort of common girl, if you like, who come together. And they form this tight friendship, even though they're from completely different backgrounds. One's new wealth, one's old wealth. And I needed, I suppose, it was exercising those demons as well as creating, obviously, an entirely fictional story about it, but it was based on you know, and at my school, it wasn't so much the kids like Marisa who were in control. It was from the age of 8 to 11, we had a house mistress who was basically abusing a lot of the girls. She'd choose people to be her pets, and I was one of them. And of course, all the other girls were envious. They used to think, wow, you've got all these special treats and whatnot. But actually, it was abuse. But at the time, you don't really see that. And then you get a little bit older and think, hey, hold on, this isn't right. So I touch on all those things in the book, but also the tight friendship. I think it's one of your other questions, and that's why this particular story had to be set there, because as you say, Marisa and Abdi, those friendships are so intense, aren't they? Because those people are your family.
Yeah.
Sure, you know, and also I was interested in from obviously the age of 8 when I was so sad, so homesick. It's like a repetition of bereavement all the time because seeing mum and dad, you're dreadfully homesick, you get used to it, you go to the holidays, and then it all happens again for the next term and again. And so it was fairly traumatic, as well as good bits as well. Great.
You know, I had friends that had been at boarding school since they were 8 as well, and one of my really, really good friends, she had a very difficult relationship with her parents, you know, because of that. You know, she didn't really want to be at boarding school. And what kind of relationship do you have with your parents when you're not really together? And it's very it's just difficult, and some people take to it really well, other people don't. It really just depends on the person. We're all different. But my friend she did have a tough time with it, and she's an amazing human, and she's doing so well for herself now. But she did definitely go through a period where, you know, there's a lot of resentment, and which I think is quite common in that situation at young boarding school age. So you're carrying all those feelings.
I was very close to my parents, and which is why I miss them so much. But I think another thing about boarding school, which is why it was suitable for my book Betray Her, is because the secrecy. I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, because I'm a bit older now, and boarding schools are completely different now in the UK. But then it was secrecy. You never told, and all these things, awful things that happen, you didn't even tell each other. You just didn't. You knew not to tell.
It's so
you didn't tell your parents. Anyway.
That's very true. It was ingrained in the culture that, you know, because it was such a bubble of an environment, and like you said, Marisa, you don't leave. Like at boarding school I went to, you needed permission to leave campus. So, and you know, I went pre-internet, pre-phone. You know, we had no television, so you live in this completely, you know, bubble of an environment, and it feels like you can't tell anyone. But I'm also curious, is the culture of sending kids as young as 8 still happening in the UK? Because in the US, I feel like it's really a high school thing.
Yeah, I think it still does go on, but I think that boarding schools are so much nicer now. I think there's mobile phones apart from anything else. So you FaceTime your parents and all that. So I think they're quite. And I think that's the other trouble about boarding school in the UK. It's considered to be a privilege. So you can't really moan about having this traumatic childhood experience, because people think, well, your mum and dad were rich enough to send you to boarding school, privilege, and you shouldn't moan about it. But that doesn't mean it was a good experience for you. But I think they're a lot better these days.
So. I think, I think in previous days, it was a lot of people, you know, children of military from young ages, or people that for whatever reason were moving regularly, foreign service or whatever. So that was often the reason for really young children being at boarding school. But it just depends on the situation, I think, and what you said as well, Caroline. Totally, tricky.
Yeah, it's really interesting listening to you, because like I'm a bit of the odd one out here because I didn't go to a boarding school. I was like really interested in like boarding school as a setting, particularly with what you were saying, Caroline, and Abdi as well, about the friendships, about how like it's sort of like a very tight community. So in my book, I've got like this setup where they can't really form these really tight, close friendships because they know that the other dancers at this boarding school are in direct comparison with each other. So you've got like this sense of isolation, and it's like the people that should now be your family cannot be, like you cannot trust them because you're all competing for exactly the same thing. So I was like really interested in that. I mean, growing up, I was really fascinated by boarding schools, and like I read like all of Enid Blyton's like Mallory Towers. I was like obsessed with those books, and it was kind of like I was wanting to explore sort of like the thing that I didn't really know, because I didn't really know what being at a boarding school was like. So I had this very sort of different view of a boarding school based on the novels that I'd been reading. And then I began to like read like this other research about what boarding schools is really like, and I discovered like this like rift between sort of like the fictionalized representation and then what it was really like. Like I didn't have the opportunity to go to a boarding school, and like I'm also disabled, and I missed a lot of like school in general, like being in hospital a lot. So I'm really like fascinated now about sort of like the teenage experience, but especially with writing YA and putting that into the boarding school environment as well. Like as you said, I think it was Marisa who said about parents like being removed from it as well. Because I mean, sometimes with the YA plots, it does make it easier if parents aren't there.
And, I was going to say that.
Telling them, oh no, don't do that. That's a really silly thing to do. But without that, it kind of gives you more freedom with your characters as well. So
absolutely.
So Caroline, you already sort of like touched on the next question a bit in terms of how effective your novel would have been if it was a different setting. So did you want to just talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, I think this particular story and this particular friendship, because I think it had the two characters, Joe and Kate, met in any other walk of life, there wouldn't have been that tight friendship and that dependency. And it's that I play with the characters where you don't quite know who's the good guy, so to speak, or the bad guy sort of thing, and they change, and there's an arc in the relationship and everything. Because basically Jo, as a little girl, she looks at Kate and thinks she's the rich princess, and her dad drops her off in a Rolls Royce, and she goes to her house, which is this lovely mansion in the country where they have tennis courts and horses and that sort of thing, and it's what she really, really aspires to. So she sort of adopts all that aspect and becomes a bit of a snob herself. And it's also there's a man in the mix. You have to have a man in the mix, don't you? And
always.
So both women, and when you discover through their teenage years and then as adults, this man affects both their lives, sort of thing. And that sort of relationship between Jo and Tom, it's called Tom, it's a bit of a Pride and Prejudice thing as well, because she has become the posh girl and he's the rough Yorkshireman, rough but very good looking Yorkshireman, of course. So I felt yes in this particular story, and there is the element of the grooming and whatnot, and so I know that can obviously happen in all walks of life, but I think it was pretty rife in a lot of boarding schools. And in fact, you were mentioning, Abdi, about you worry about people going, let's take this to the law. Well, a contemporary of mine did report it when she was much older to the local police, and they did investigate the woman in question, but at the end of the day it was dropped because she was considered to be too old, which is a bit frustrating a little, because it doesn't mean we didn't do it, does it? But yeah, it's all quite fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that was really interesting. So
there are elements of all this. Well, obviously it's fictional, the story, but read a lot in, and it's great, isn't it? It's great therapy.
It really is, actually. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, so many things, and I feel like I can tell stories that I probably shouldn't tell without worrying about it too much. There's little factoids that you can sneak in. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I guess,
Marisa, what about? Oh, sorry, Abdi, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead, Marisa.
No, I was done.
Oh, you're done. No, I was going to say, I think one of the things, because in answer to your question about, I think it was like, could it have been told in another location? Yeah. And I suppose like one thing in writing the book and in observing all the amazing change that's happening in the world in the last decade is, I suppose it could be, because really, I think what my book is about is the way that when an institution is more powerful than its individuals, it will create a culture of secrecy. We've seen that happen in Hollywood, in churches, in athletic associations. We've seen it happen all over governments. I mean, really, I think what the book is about how individuals have to come together to, raise their voices when an institution is telling them we matter more than you. And this is happened in so many environments. So my hope is that if people read the book, they think about that, and they think about how, we have to kind of move away from that model of allowing these institutions to matter more, and their secrets and their health shouldn't matter more than the health of their individual members. Yeah. So that's
great point.
I think
really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Like a lot of the themes that you're looking at in these books, they are like quite profound, quite deep, really important things that sort of like need to be talked about more. So and of course, like when you're building on sort of like personal experience as well, we've talked a bit about how fear plays into that, and sort of like almost the idea of like there being sort of real-time repercussions. Did that actually affect you when you were doing sort of like your first drafts? Were you sort of like able to compartmentalize that fear and set it aside just so that you could tell the story? Or did that fear almost dictate and change the way that you were writing the story in any sense?
I personally, I was the other way. I sort of wanted, I know it's a fictional story, but I wanted to talk about it. And this is the first time I've been on a boarding school panel. So thank you very much, Madeline. I'm having more therapy here. I thought it might be picked up on, but no one, because obviously there are other aspects of the story. It's a thriller, it's about betrayal and murder. So there's lots of other elements of it, but a lot. I got great reviews, and people knew it was a boarding school setting, but didn't particularly pick up on the boarding school elements so much. So this is lovely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Fantastic. Yeah. For me, I don't feel any particular restraint or fear. I think it's been so long now since I was at school that I've been able to put a lot of those things behind me. And when I look back on my experiences and the things I learned, I can do that, logically. I've been through my own mental health issues. I've been through therapy for years. I've come out the other side of that, and nothing to do with the boarding school, but I can use it for my own selfish gain, as it were, rather than be worried by it. And also because I know the school that I went to has dramatically changed, and it's become one of the best schools for mental health since I left. So I can think very positive things about that school now. And I know that the things that occurred when I was there, when my brother was there, and years before that, are no longer happening. So I can feel quite positive when I talk about the stuff that used to happen. And I don't feel like I'm going to be in trouble or that I'm blaming the school, because I'm not. I think it's a fantastic school. But I still like to tell these stories that you couldn't make up if you tried. Think of things that people did. You couldn't even, you couldn't even imagine it. So, but it's all here and all for the using.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said in the beginning, for me, it's a scary process. It's a scary process to write. Any writing is scary, I think. All writers should be scared, because it's frightening to stare at a blank page and to have to fill it with something that, matters to you. But it's also really liberating. So, it's
that's a great turn of phrase.
Also, I'm a former lawyer, so there's also obviously the worry about writing something libelous, but it's fiction, so we're fine.
Yeah, I do worry about, because I have another book that I've written, which is a bit more serious, and it's about one of these. So here at Abdi in the UK, it's 5 years of high school, so you start in 8th grade. And it's about an eighth grader who commits suicide. And it's not one thing, it's a culmination of lots of things. And as you go through the book and you see things from all of his friends, all of his frenemies, his enemies' perspectives, you start to understand why he made this decision. And I've always worried about that, because, I don't hold the school accountable, and nobody I knew committed suicide while I was there. But it's just, you can easily see how these things would all factor into a young person's mental health when they're on their own for the first time, without the security of their parents and things like that. So that's a book I haven't published, and I still want to. I kind of think of it as a British 13 Reasons Why.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I need to explore that more, but that's a lot more serious than my other one that I'm working on at the moment, because that really does deal with the mechanics of boarding school and what it actually does to people. It's my watch going off. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just curious about how much research you do for obviously when we're writing sort of fictional stories and we've got a boarding school in it. There's going to be a lot of fictional elements to a boarding school in a lot of cases, just to make them different, especially if you've got personal experience as well. So how do you tackle sort of creating a boarding school that is a fictionalized school, but that also feels authentic and real? So do you have a research process, or do you sort of just write organically and see how it develops and then shape it a bit later?
No, I don't. I just use my own experiences, and go from there and tidy it up a bit, because as I said, things have improved, and you know, there's more focus on mental health at boarding schools and things like that now. So I really just rely on my own experience of being there and what that felt like, because that feels most authentic to me. Because I think if I try to write from a point of view of somebody else's experience, say they were utterly miserable, or they were the richest kid, or the Sultan of Brunei, or something, that wouldn't feel genuine to me. So I can only write from the experience that I felt, and hope that that sounds authentic, and that is enough to portray that whole vibe, I think.
Yeah, I'm the same. I mean, I'm drawing on personal experiences when it comes to the thing. But I did discover there's something called boarding school syndrome. And apparently there are these personality traits if you have boarding school syndrome. And if you look at the traits, I've got them all. And I thought, can that really be a thing? Or would I have been like that anyway? That's interesting. So yeah, you have to look it up, see it tick off.
So what are these traits? I'm scared now.
I've noted a few down here, and it says British for solid competence, shame because of this privilege point, self-reliance, pride and endurance. Because I'm that pride and endurance, I'll go to the kids. Oh, if it hurts, it's good for you. You know. Low self-esteem within. Not able to share feelings, same way, like structure, keeping busy, and bottle emotional problems. I mean, I might have just been like that anyway, but who knows?
Well, yeah, you never know, do you? It's interesting what you say about shame. I was just going to say, I remember when I went to university, and I had been to private schools all my life. So obviously I come from a privileged background. And I remember going to university and people saying, oh, you went to such and such a school and you live on such and such a street. And I'd never really thought about it. I just, my dad came from a 2-bedroom family with 4 siblings from utter poverty, and he did well for himself. So I never felt anything but pride for what my father could then provide for us and how well he did. So to then feel, I don't know, for people to give me a hard time about the fact that I went to a nice school or lived in a nice house, it made me angry, because I just thought, you don't know my history, you don't know my parents' history, it's got nothing to do with me. You know, I didn't have a choice in any of that. So it's really interesting that you say that. I think there are so many emotions involved in that, that, you know, I still don't know how I feel sometimes, actually. Yeah.
There's so many interesting things. Like, Caroline, from what you were saying, I was thinking, like, the truth is I have all those, you know, probably boarding school syndrome, but then I think those values were also the values of my family and culture. Like in Persian culture, there's very model emotions, don't reveal the secrets of the family, don't, you know, stiff upper lip. I mean, that's the whole culture too. So I'm wondering, well, if I didn't go to boarding school, would I still have that syndrome? But one thing that was very interesting, when I went to college, in my very first week, made a group of friends and did not realize until the end of that week that they had all gone to boarding school. And I think there was almost this secret communication we had with each other, because we were the kids who had already been away from home for 4 years. It wasn't, the other kids were just arriving. They were nervous. They were scared of the work. I mean, for us, it was like, we're already grown-ups. And I think there was really almost this secret communication happening, that I think is very interesting. It is a very impactful experience. What was your question, Madeline? Now I can't even remember.
That was a question.
I was asking. I was asking how much research you do into boarding schools, and whether you try to make them sort of more fictional than the ones that you actually attended.
Yeah. Who needs research when you live it? You know, it's fine.
That's true. Although I have to say, if I were writing about a boarding school today, I would probably have had to do more research. Like, I went back for my last high school reunion pre-COVID, and the boarding school, while it looked the same, and that's, you know, boarding schools are so old, you go there and you're like, oh God, it smells the same, it looks the same, but you know, it felt so different. Kids had cell phones. There were there were like keypads outside all the dorms, and in my mind, I'm like, how do you sneak out at night? We were always sneaking out. We were going into the the party. And you know, so much of my story was specific
Oh my God,
to
yes.
a time in the 1990s when that culture of abuse hadn't been challenged yet. So that was important to my story. But the other important part was the lack of technology and monitoring, because there was this freedom for kids to go out and be on their own. We were always in the woods. We were always like sneaking out. And, you know, I asked my favorite teacher who was still teaching there at my last reunion, like, what's the biggest difference between us and these kids? And he said the biggest difference is they don't have any fun. And I think, you know, there is something. The boarding schools now, you know, that boarding schools now probably are safer. And I think they've made really great changes. You know, one of the changes I was so happy about it is that they now have gender neutral dorms for kids who are queer or who don't want to live. I think a lot of my problems honestly stemmed from being, you know, a young, gay, closeted kid in a very testosterone driven dorm where I was obviously the one who didn't fit in. I think in a world where I could have been in a dorm with other kids who didn't fit neatly into the, you know, gender spectrum would have helped me. But I also think there was something so specific about the not being monitored. The fact that kids now have to, like, there was keypads everywhere and cameras and technology. It's, if I were to write about that, I would have had to research what it feels like to be a kid.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point there. I mean, I remember being in sixth form, so the last 2 years of high school, and getting the train into Guildford, which was half an hour away, hitting the pub for a couple of hours, having a couple of pints of cider, getting a little bit boozy, then going to the grocery store, picking up some bottles of cider for whoever I needed to bring it back to. This was always on a Saturday. And we had prep on a Saturday for like from 6 till 7:30, but we wouldn't do anything. And it was okay to gather in each other's rooms and we would sit there drinking. And then we had an hour and a half where we could just run around the school grounds, you know, and people were smoking, people were still drinking, you know, and that's what we used to do. So I have no idea if they've cracked down on that kind of thing now. So you raise a good point. I probably should go and check on that and I'll just ring up the school and say, hey, are kids still doing this? You know, but we did. So there you go. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. I'm letting too many secrets out now.
It's all coming out now.
It's just really interesting, like soaking up all this about what it's actually like, what it was really like at boarding schools. Because obviously, like without having any personal experience myself, like a kind of the closest thing is like when I was in hospital for like long periods of time as a teenager, and I was just like confined to the ward, and there'll be like the other like patients at the hospital and the beds, and like we formed like a community. So like I kind of like had that community feel then, but those people always changing. So like there's one person that I became really good friends with, and I'm still really good friends with them now, and we kept in touch, and like we were like in hospital for like several weeks at the same time, but with everyone else it was like constant changeover pretty much day to day. And yeah, what you were saying earlier about when going to like college and university, and how like the people that have already been to a boarding school are almost like set up to deal with it better, and they have like they're equipped with those skills. That was very apparent to me when I went, because like I was commuting and I was also doing it part-time so that I could still have my medical treatment. And I really felt like almost like I didn't really fit in with the other people that were commuting because they were going there every day. So I felt like a bit different in that respect. And then sort of the rest of my week, I'd be back at the hospital with some of the people that I knew, but then even them were changing. But I always found it easier to relate to them, even if they were like brand new that day, because they also had that same experience of being in hospital a lot and sometimes spending more time like, in the hospital environment than sort of like in a classroom at school. So yeah, I mean, it's funny when you talk about sneaking out, like there are a couple of stories about like us all sneaking out of a ward at night at hospital. Some of the girls who wanted to go out and smoke, and they had the rule that you couldn't go out on your own, but you had to go out in a group of 3 or 4, and they had to sort of like sign you in and out. So like the nurses knew that we were like escaping. They just pretended not to notice, but they knew exactly where we were at all times. And it was really funny because some of them were a lot more tolerant to it, and others would like make a big show of like pretending not to see you, just turning away at the exact moment when you were coming back in. And yet others would be like watching you almost like with binoculars from a window to check that you were still safe and like where you were.
That is exactly what it was like at boarding school. So you have had that experience, totally.
Okay.
Yeah, it is exactly what it was like. Yeah. And I think, you know, one thing I just want to, I think as we've been talking, and this is so fascinating. I've never been on a boarding school panel. It's so cool to talk to other people who are interested in these things. But, you know, one thing that was very important for me in exploring this, and in it for anyone who watches this, is I feel like sometimes, especially in the YA world, or when we talk to young people, and I have 2 kids, they're 10. They're actually at sleepaway camp for the first time, which I suppose is very apt, given this conversation. But there's this tendency to want to frame things as either all good or all bad, and draw very clear lines. And I think what I really grappled with in writing this book is how, for me, boarding school had some of the most awful, traumatic things that ever happened to me happen there. The institution allowed those things, protected those things. I have a lot of anger. At the same time, what we're talking about, the friendships were life-changing. I mean, those are still my best friends. I think as scary as it is for kids to be away from their parents, I came from a very conservative culture. My family had a lot of trouble accepting my sexuality. It took them, I didn't even come out until my mid-20s, and it took a long time, and there's still work to be done. But, you know, in boarding school, I had adult mentors who were supportive, who saw, you know, the first person I came out to was an English teacher at boarding school. There was a queer teacher who showed me queer films that changed my life. You know, so there's this really interesting thing I was thinking about as I was writing the book, which is like, how can this place that broke me down in so many ways and does so many awful things to people also be the place that gave me so many gifts? And I think that's, I don't know, that's something that really fascinates me, like how we can always find joy and community, even in places that are, you know, so harsh in so many ways.
Yeah, Abdi, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think, you know, I don't know if I know anybody who looks back on boarding school and says it was the most fantastic experience. And I think a lot of people have experienced trauma, and a lot of, as you say, we've all received gifts at the same time. And it's just, you spend a long time trying to sort through those things and trying to figure out what's valuable and what you can let go, and how to let go of the things you need to let go, and how to learn from those things at the same time. And we can spend a lifetime doing that. And I think that is one of the most fascinating things about having a boarding school setting, is there's so much nuance. And those of us who have had experience of what it feels like to be there can bring those you know, little details to attend that can really make that experience real. I think what you said was great. I think what you said is probably the highlight of the whole panel. So
well, because I think also when you're writing YA, it's about like, well, what are you also trying to communicate to young people? And I think young people inevitably are going through trauma. It's growing up is traumatic. I mean, it really is. You're going from a youthful idea. I mean, I see it in all the kids that I hang out with. You start as an idealist. We all start looking at the world, you know, through ideal glasses. And then little by little, you start to realize how harsh the world can be. But I think reminding young people that no matter, you know, my previous book was about the AIDS epidemic and AIDS activism in New York in the 80s, but it was also about friendship and community and music and how much the community came together. So I think just reminding young people, no matter what you're going through, how traumatic, how hard it is, human beings throughout our history have always managed to create community and art and, you know, all the beautiful things, even in the darkest time. And I think that's, when I think of boarding school, that's something it taught me. And I think that's...
I want to see your therapist, because whoever that is, they sound amazing. Get me there.
You got to come to Los Angeles.
Perfect.
I'm really intrigued to say, I mean, whether a boarding school in the Los Angeles area, I'd love to experience that, sort of like maybe as a time travel and go and taste it and see how it did compare with a British boarding school, which is so sort of British. In fact, betray her. Catherine Hagel, the actress, she phoned me where I'm sat now one time, and she was interested in adapting it as a miniseries. Well, it all just disappeared, as these things do. But she was going to transplant the whole story. She said she'd do nothing with it because the way I'd panned it out, she'd just do it episode by episode. But she was going to take it over to America. And I was thinking, can an English boarding school?
Can you? Yeah.
Fascinating.
Wow.
I wish it had happened because that would have been.
And she's amazing. I love her. She's incredible.
Yeah. And it was a bit weird.
I think you can. I think you can transplant it. I don't think they're that. I mean, my dad went to boarding school. You know, in Iran at the time of my dad's youth, it was fairly common for families who could afford it to send their kids to boarding school in Europe. So he went to boarding school in London. I went to boarding school in Connecticut, actually, not in California.
Okay, yeah.
So the West Coast boarding schools here, I have heard, are a little different. I think there's, you know, the East Coast boarding schools, I think probably are closer to British.
Yeah.
But it was,
my cousins were at boarding schools in Massachusetts. So I think they're a bit more traditional as well. Yeah.
Yes, they're more traditional.
Yeah.
But it's also very interesting because the boarding school I went to, like, I think my father thought he was sending me to a version of his boarding school. And obviously, not just the place was different, but the time. The boarding school I went to was so liberal when I went, like the values, you know, in terms of what public facing was so liberal, but yet they still had those same values of like keeping the secrets of the school and covering up the abuse. And it's very interesting how their external facing values and their internal values were at odds with each other.
I suppose it's all to do with human frailty, isn't it? At the end of the day, it's all, you know, to the bad people. They're going to be bad people everywhere, and the good people are going to be good people everywhere, and all those emotions. And,
and there's going to be corruption everywhere. I mean, I think boarding schools where I really learned about corruption because there were really, you know, I had a lot of friends who got expelled. And in my boarding school, I don't know about your boarding schools. In my boarding school, when you got expelled, if you were caught, you know, doing drugs or something that was an expellable offense, you were gone that second. You didn't say goodbye to your friends.
Yeah.
Like, I would go back to my dorm. It's like, where's this person? Oh, they're gone. Like, what do you mean? My friend is gone? But if you were a kid whose family had a lot of money and who made donations, there were kids at boarding school that we were fully aware were above the law. And that's a real lesson because the truth is many people in the world
absolutely and remain above the law. Yeah, that really opened my eyes to that situation, those connections, those money talks, you know, all of that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so one thing that I'm really intrigued by just listening to this and just thinking of the other novels that I've read that are also set in boarding schools, usually there'll be one or two characters who are there on like scholarship, and in a lot of these setups, those characters are separated a lot, or they're not sort of like fully integrated into the group of like the characters who are able to afford to go to a boarding school. So is that a bit of a stereotype, or is that actually sort of like reflecting reality in some actual schools?
I think it used to be more of an issue than it is now. Now, when you get a scholarship, it's only like 10%. So it's not actually, you know, financially, it's not actually that significant. And so I don't think it separates the them and us particularly that much, but you will get, I mean, I had one of my best friends was on a bursary. They couldn't afford the fees. I was aware of it, not in a negative way, just, you know, but there were people that were so wealthy. So there were degrees of wealth, and people knew who was wealthy and people knew who was not wealthy. But I think if you were particularly talented, I mean, the school I went to was very military focused and very sport focused, as well as academic. You had to be academic anyway. And so if you weren't sporty, so it didn't really matter so much about the wealth of the scholarship, but if you were on a sports scholarship, then you would be the god of the school, basically.
Right.
Yeah. I went for sixth form just for the 2 years to a boys' school. They just had one girls' house, and now it's co-ed. And in fact, I'm going there tomorrow for a literary festival.
Oh my God, I really want to know what school, because it's the same for me. We're going to have to...
we'll have to discuss later, but...
we will.
Yeah, and I'm my time now. I mean, I just came in, you know, we had a lovely girls' house and everything, so it was really nice. But in the male, if you were a sporty guy, you were a god. And didn't matter how academic you were or not, if you were sporty, that was it. You were absolutely God sort of thing. So in fact, we called them the gods. So yeah.
Yeah,
But,
you know,
I did get smacked across the head at that school one time. I was talking in the library and a smack came from nowhere. And it was, honestly, I saw, you know, they say you see stars. I saw stars. I was a rebel because my older brothers had been there and I wore a boy's suit because, you know, wanted to be a bit different. I think they thought I was a boy. Crack.
Yeah. I was a bit... I didn't really kowtow to the traditional method. So there was a scenario where you could get banned from the boys' houses for various ridiculous offences. And my friend and I got banned. And you were supposed to write a letter grovelling to the head of house saying, I want to be allowed back in, blah, 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 you know. And I decided I wasn't going to write that kind of letter. I was going to write a really sarcastic, you know, A4 length piss take. And I got a response similarly back saying I was banned forever. And, you know, and I arrived in dining hall the next day. I got this round of applause from both boys and girls, but the girls were applauding me for my bravery. The boys were just like, you absolute, what are you doing? And even though this has been a main public boys boarding school, I was like, I'm a modern girl. I'm not kowtowing to these ridiculous traditional methods. I'm too feisty for that. So I got myself in trouble because I didn't follow tradition. And no, but I still don't regret any of that. I am proud of standing up for women's rights. Exactly. So, yeah, I know what you mean.
How about you, Abdi? Because it sounds as though your boarding school is very privileged if you had like actors and, you know, the elite.
Sure. Oh yeah, I mean, gosh, like there was an immense privilege at the school. But it's also very interesting. I mean, many of my friends from boarding school came from incredible privilege, and many of my friends really didn't. You know, they came from very regular, you know, there were kids on full scholarship. There were kids from just, you know, middle-class families who never would have been able to afford it, but their kids were, you know, either wanted to go, got in because of their intelligence, athletics, you know, whatever it was. One thing when I look back at boarding school, I think there was a sense of like not thinking about it. There were moments where I forgot about it in boarding school itself because you're all together, you're all living in the same dorm rooms. There is a sense of equality to it. And when I was young, I mean, what was cool was to wear like vintage flannels. It wasn't like now. I mean, now I see kids the way they dress. There's a consumerism to the teen culture that I think wasn't as present when I was young. Where I saw the most difference in terms of where the privilege really started to come in was honestly when boarding school was over. I think something that I observed was that once boarding school was over, the kids from privilege, their privileges were much more apparent. They got to go to the fancier colleges, to the Ivy, they could afford it. Whereas like some of the kids who didn't come from privilege, they had to go to a different kind of school. The kids from privilege got to move to the big cities because their families kind of gave them the money to set up shop in New York or LA or wherever. Whereas the kids who didn't, and I think one thing, you know, we don't really talk enough about as a culture is how much that kind of privilege sets you up for success. You know, once you leave boarding school, because you have that little boost that some kids don't. And I think it can be a very confusing thing, I think, to realize, because in boarding school, there's almost a sense of, you know, almost equality. Not really, because you all know deep down. But once you get out of boarding school, it's like, oh, wow, yeah, that person lives a very different lifestyle than that person.
I mean, my school still has a huge alumni presence, and there are reunions and there are networking events. And what can you do for the kids coming up? And what do you need from the people, you know? So there's a huge old boys network, shall we call it, which can be really advantageous to be part of, you know. And as a result, as an author, they've got my books in the library, you know, all these things, which is great. But it's all about rubbing shoulders and backs and reciprocation and, you know, all of that, which is makes me feel a little bit icky sometimes. So.
Yeah, so it's been really interesting, sort of like listening to sort of like these stories from actual real life boarding school experiences. So I'm just wondering, just sort of like as we're getting to the end of this panel now, whether you could each tell me what your favorite book is that's set in a boarding school. So Caroline, would you like to go first with this?
Yeah. When you answered, excuse me, that question, I sort of thought, well, I've never read one, because there's all the enlightenment, because I lived it. I didn't need to read one. But Never Let Me Go. Have you read that one? That's amazing, because I started reading it and I thought, oh, this is like a boarding school story. Then you realise why the children are in this boarding school, and it's to harvest their organs, which is just, I just can't get my head around that still. I just think it's so funny. I think also The Secret History was a boarding, or was that a college?
That's true. Yes.
Secret History was college, I think.
Yeah, but same thing.
College.
It was elite,
wasn't it?
Similar. There's a great, well, for anyone who loves this Secret History, which I love, there's a great podcast called Once Upon a Time at Bennington. I might get the name wrong, but I think it's called Once Upon a Time at Bennington College. And it's about, it was this very, very unique college. And Donna Tartt, Bret Easton Ellis, and now I can't remember, but one other huge author were all there at the same time. And it's about this, like, these wild years at this liberal school where these great authors all intermingled, and how The Secret History was very much inspired by that place.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But very similar, like that vibe.
Yes. Yeah.
Such a good book.
Yeah. I need to read that again. It's been a long time since I've read that. I mentioned The Worst Witch. I think that was probably my introduction into boarding school types of books, and obviously it had magic, and it's Harry Potter for my generation. Clearly Harry Potter, you can't not mention Harry Potter, because that's Harry Potter. I also loved, and Madeline, maybe you're aware of these, the Sadler's Wells books, which were all ballet focused, about becoming part of Sadler's Wells, which is a prestigious London ballet company. And I loved those. I grew up on those. Another one that I read, Monster by C.J. Skuse, which is about a boarding school where there's a few students that have to stay over the Christmas holiday period, and there's a monster in the snow. And I really enjoyed that. I like the horror, I like the thriller, I like the isolation. So not classic boarding school, lots of people around, but and I got to say, Abdi, when you mentioned Dead Poets Society, that is one of my all-time favorite films. I just think that really encapsulates everything about a boarding school. It's just, and Robin Williams, I think that's probably my favorite Robin Williams role. I just think it's incredible. I think I cry every time I watch that film. Every time.
It's similar to The History Boys. Have you ever seen that? The Alan Bennett.
Yes, The History Boys.
Very similar vibe,
Yes.
I've always loved stories about mentors, teachers. Like there's something about those stories that are so powerful to me. I mean, Dead Poet Society, I agree. My boarding school, obviously it was co-ed, it was liberal, it was the 1990s, but Dead Poet Society captured the emotions of the experience so well. And that what I was talking about earlier, like the darkness, but also the joy and the light, like the way it balanced the true
friendship.
trauma. I mean, no spoilers for people who haven't seen it, but
I know. It's just, it's one of those really, really special films that you see something different every time, don't you? It really is.
My favorite Robin Williams performance. And Ethan Hawke looked and acted identical to one of my best friends from boarding school. I mean, when I watch the movie, I still feel like I'm. But I will say, since you asked our favorite boarding school book and nobody's mentioned it, I'm going to say Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld, which for those who haven't read it, is do you guys not know Curtis Sittenfeld? No. If you haven't read her, is one of my favorite authors. She's a genius. She's written, I feel like, every book. My favorite of hers is probably American Wife, which was a novel inspired by the life of Laura Bush. The first lady. It's a novelization, but it's really great. And she wrote one called Hillary about it's like a alternative history about Hillary Clinton had she not married Bill. She writes great books. Great books. Prep,
oh, that sounds
I read everything. She has a book of short stories that's brilliant.
No.
I've read everything she's written. She's a genius. But Prep is probably the first book I read that really was about the era of boarding school I went to. It's really about, like, it wasn't a lot of boarding school stories I feel like are set in older times, or like Harry Potter, they're turned into something
magical.
genre. It's turned into something magical. Prep was the first thing I read where I felt like, oh wow, this person went to the kind of school I went to in the era I went. It's not a book with a lot of plot, but the level of detail and specificity, I feel like if you want to know what it was like to go to boarding school in the kind of late 20th century, that book captures it.
Okay.
Great. I will look out for that book.
I'm writing that down.
Yeah, we have just had a question come in from a viewer. So I'm just going to pop it up on the screen now. So how realistic is it that teachers at a boarding school wouldn't get police involved when a crime is committed, but would deal with it internally?
I think it depends on the crime. I think when you're looking at things like underage smoking, or potentially even underage sex, they'd more likely expel you, or, well, for smoking in my school, there were disciplinary actions. They would never get the police involved. For being caught sexually active, you would be expelled. And they wouldn't get the police involved. Drugs, they would, and you would be expelled immediately. So they were really, really hardcore on drugs. So I think bullying was a lot harder because it's harder to prove. And I don't remember there a case where there was ever the police involved in a bullying case. It was always done internally, but it took forever. My brother and I were both bullied when we were at boarding school because at the time we had really strong American accents, and that didn't go down well in a posh British boarding school. So we had our own issues with that. But also there's the whole, am I going to speak out about this? No, neither of us did. So it depends. So I think in my time, there were definitely a lot of things that weren't taken to the police that maybe should have done. Today, I think, I don't know. I think it's probably similar, to be honest. I think sexual crimes were harassment would probably be more well reported. But I can't speak on today's world. I can only speak on what I experienced at the time. Yeah.
My novel would probably not have been written if, I can't remember how long exactly, but about 5 years ago, the school conducted, after, a very brave person came forward with allegations of abuse that happened while she was at the school conducted an investigation. They released a 50-page, I believe it was a very long report about the history of abuse at the school. It went back a long time. It also covered the time I was there. There was a tremendous amount of abuse, and the report only focused on teachers and sexual abuse, not even on hazing.
Wow.
But the report laid out, and then it was sent out to all the alumni. So I was on the phone all night with all my friends from boarding school, like, oh my God, did you read this? It was very clear. Again, I can't speak to today. I think today, hopefully the culture's changed, but it was very clear how much was covered up and concealed by the school. Much like the Catholic Church, many teachers who were accused just got letters of recommendation and were sent to other schools to teach. So I don't know that back then getting the police involved was something that happened very often.
Yeah, I mean,
I never knew the police be involved at all. So
yeah. To be honest, the abuse culture that went on at my boarding school was typically between your older students to your younger students. Teachers had no idea what was going on.
Right.
So if it had been reported, I'm sure police would have been involved, but it never was. It was always under the radar. But the drug stuff they cracked down on that heavily. They were really, really not tolerant with drugs. So they actually cut down all the rhododendron bushes. There was this amazing drive that led up to the main house of these beautiful purple rhododendron bushes, and they cut them all down because that's where people went to smoke. And they thought, no, not having that anymore. So they just got rid of them all. and it's ruined the whole site for me now.
They're so lovely, rhododendrons, when they flower, aren't they?
I know. Yeah, never mind.
Right, well, thank you all of you for joining me for this panel. I really enjoyed listening to this conversation, and it's been really, really useful, especially for my next book, which I'm thinking of setting at a boarding school. So thank you. Before we go, sorry?
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would each of you like to just tell the audience where they can find you online just before we log off? Sure. Abdi, do you want to go first with that?
Sure. I suppose I'm on all the social medias, though I'm really only active on Instagram. I'm Abdaddy on Instagram and Twitter. And you can also find me at my website, abdinazemian.com.
Okay, great. And Caroline?
Yeah, I'm same on excuse me again. I'm Kaz England on Twitter, and then on Instagram and Facebook, I'm Kaz England with a 1 because someone stole the Kaz England already. So yeah, and I have a website as well, although I don't update it as much as I should, which is carolineenglandauthor.co.uk.
Great. And Marisa?
Yeah, I have a website, which is marisanoelle.com, and I do a newsletter every month when I can scramble together usually cocktail recipes and free chapters and, you know, what I'm doing, what I'm reading, that kind of thing. And I am everywhere. There is not a social media platform that you won't find me, but I am most active on TikTok, and I am Marisa Noelle 12. So do come and hang out with me and watch me being an absolute fool, because it can be quite funny, I think.
Okay, well, thank you again for all of you for joining me today. It's been a really enlightening and informative conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.